Can y'all still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, slide is up.
I do see that Kat is on. Kat, do you want to unmute quickly?
Yeah, Kat had called me, so.
Hey all, I think there are some attendees in the
We're aware. We're gonna get started. Do you want to keep tabs on the question and answers while I'm presenting?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so we are starting right on time, everybody. Thank you so much. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. I know a few folks might be filtering in, so I thought now might be a good time to just go around and introduce everybody and talk a little bit about how this briefing is going to work. So my name is Allison Murphy. I am the Director of Policy and Communications over at the 40th Ward, and we are have quite a packed agenda today. We're going to go over some of the basic things about the Chicago budget process, answer some of the questions folks had in the budget survey. We have Geoffrey Cubbage here from the Better Government Association, who's going to do an overview of this year's budget. And then Alder Vasquez is also going to answer some of your questions about the future of this year's budget and some of the conversations that he's having with his colleagues over in City Council. And we'll wrap up by talking about a few ways that you can stay involved and keep giving us your feedback, staying updated on what's going on. So Alderperson, want to introduce yourself? Not that you probably need to.
Hey everybody, how are y'all doing? I'm glad that we have folks on the call. As Allison had stated, we'll be recording this for other folks as well. I think many of you all have probably been tuning into the news and kind of getting a sense of really what's been happening in the budget, but it's probably at a really high level, right? I think most people might have first tuned in when they heard about a potential $300 million property tax increase that Mayor Johnson was proposing, and then subsequently might have seen how the City Council voted that down. So what we're really going to do is kind of get a 3,000-foot view of like what the budget process looks like and go through things as Allison described. So we can kind of just jump on in. And then if you have questions, feel free to type them in. That way we're able to either answer them as they're coming along, or we can track them to answer at the end. What we've typically done on these calls is we'll go through all the different questions that are being asked. Once we get those answered, we'll open it up for other questions that might be available in the time permitted. So yeah, let's get started, shall we?
Let's do it. So first, Alder Vasquez. Actually, Geoffrey, do you want to introduce yourself real quick just before we launch right in?
Yeah.
Sure. I think there's an intro slide later on, and we'll just skip right over it. But good evening, everyone. My name is Geoffrey Cubbage. I'm a budget and policy analyst with the Better Government Association, which is a 101-year-old watchdog, nonpartisan nonprofit watchdog that's here in Chicago. We have our newsroom, the Illinois Answers Project, and then our policy shop, BGA Policy, that I'm a member of. I've been doing city budgets for a while. I worked in Alderman Vasquez's office several years ago, so some of you may remember me from other Zoom calls about zoning changes and streetscape development and other fun times, but I've kept my hand in on the budget side and now do the daily snapshots for the Better Government Association. We try to get a breakdown of every department's proposed budget and changes before the department hearings happen that are going on right now. So when we get to the BGA chunk of the slides, we'll dive a little bit into the budget as a general overview, and also a couple of the departments that I know Alderman Vasquez said y'all are most interested in.
Awesome. So we're going to start off with a quick budget 101, just to learn a little bit about this year's budget for those of you who might not have to spend as much time on it as we do. So Alder Vasquez, take it away.
Yeah, definitely. So and we kind of mentioned some of the stuff online, so those folks who may have followed on social media in one way or the other kind of might be familiar with some of this, but let's just kind of start. So when you think about the city budget, what we're really talking about are three different ordinances that comprise what the city budget looks like. It's a whole process, but it is basically broken down into those three. You've got your revenue ordinance, which is what funds is the city taking in, whether it be through taxes, fees, what revenues are normally coming in. So it's really all comprised in the revenue ordinance. You've got your appropriations ordinance. So is that money being spent, the expenditures, right? Is it programs? Is it staffing? Is it headcount? When we're talking about the city, you're talking about 35 different departments and a mayor's office. So that is a large series of conglomerates that you're putting together and figuring out how to fund. And then you've got your management ordinance, and your management ordinance can actually be a little bit of all the above. There have been different things that are usually put in a management ordinance, but typically what we're thinking about is how the budget process moves forward, how things are happening when we're having a budget address, what processes one can put into place so that year over year you're getting better at this and accounting for things, right? So if you want to do studies on how things are being successful or not, you can put that in the management ordinance. Sometimes it's part of like deal conversations will be included in management ordinance as far as what you're doing forward as far as programs. So those three come together. The mayor introduces them, the city council negotiates, and then you figure out what we can all land on. But it's also important to note what is not part of the city budget, because I think most people, when you're looking at your property tax or other taxes, you're like, this city is taxing me too much. And there are different taxing bodies that are combined there. So for example, Chicago Public Schools, CPS, is actually not the city budget. It's got its own budget and its own ability to levy taxes onto people to fund itself. Chicago Park District has its own budget. CTA has its own budget. CHA has its own budget. So those are all different city-related sister agencies that are often thought of as being part of the city budget, but they're not. And then, of course, you've got your county, your state, and other taxes as well to consider. So next slide. So kind of as I was gonna, a quick rundown earlier. So the departments submit their budgets to the Office of Budget Management, and that is typically at the end of July every year is when they get their first budgets from those departments. The Office of Budget Management, our budget director, Annette Guzman, in this term, looks at all those different budgets from the departments. It looks at all the other revenue, all the data that you've got and collect as a city, and then starts looking at it, puts together a forecast to say, here's what we're looking at. We're seeing a deficit that is this large, and gives you kind of a breakdown of what expenditures have been, what projections have been from the year prior. Then that's typically probably around September timeframe, sometimes mid-September. And then the mayor typically would do a budget address, which would be announcing the mayor's proposal for how to solve the deficits mid-October. This year, however, Mayor Johnson actually pushed things back, and so we did not get a budget address until October 30th. That ultimately makes it a little bit more challenging to resolve things, right? You've got to figure out, as soon as you get these like telephone book size documents, you've got to then start to analyze and resolve and figure out what you can support, what changes you want to see. So that's, while you're looking at that, there are typically over the span of about 3 weeks budget hearings, right? Each of the departments that we're talking about, all 35 of them, as well as the mayor's office and the budget office, the comptroller, they all come and testify before a city council, typically to answer questions that folks may have. So while that's occurring, most of it is happening in City Hall. Typically an administration has their intergovernmental folks who basically are the liaisons between the city council and the administration, who then start asking us, how do we feel about the budget? What things do you want to see changed? What ideas do you might have about things you want to see include to kind of get the support? And so they talk to basically all 50 members of city council to get to 26. And so the reason why I want to frame how that comes together is oftentimes I think people think about a budget as though a mayor presents it, vote that thing down. That should solve it. Just tell them, just vote it down. But in reality, if you're a mayor, you're looking at 50 people and trying to find 26. So it doesn't often happen that anything gets voted down. I mean, what happened just a couple of weeks ago for the 50-0 vote against the $300 million property tax increase is extremely rare to see. More often than not, a mayor can continue talking to everyone until they figure out where the 26 votes are, and then they present the vote to actually get it voted on. But that's not what's occurred so far, which is, again, extremely unique. Next slide. All right, so like we were saying, the revenue is all the funds that are coming in. So that's your taxes, your fees, your fines, your grants, which could be, we'll get into that. So local funds are money generated by activities that fall under city control. When we talk about the city budget, it's a $17 billion budget, but what we're really focused on is the corporate fund, right? So, and that's about, I think, 4 to 5 billion, I think, total. I think I'm not right on that. So to frame that for you, the whole larger budget is full of things that are mandated payments, right? You're paying your pensions, you're paying certain funds. There's also different departments like the enterprise funds, which I'll be getting to. So your Department of Water Management, O'Hare, those things are kind of self-funded and have their own funds. They're part of this larger budget. But when we're really talking about what the city council is solving for, it's the corporate fund. It's a smaller section of the whole budget that's actually more malleable. You can actually make changes in ways that you can't in other parts of government. So that's what's typically put towards general operations. It's paying for staff, for headcount programs. Corporate fund does that. Okay, 5.62 billion for corporate fund. Thank you for that, Geoffrey. The enterprise funds, like I mentioned, it's kind of like these self-contained systems. Your airport is a self-contained system. Your Department of Water Management, it funds itself, right? The water bill leads to funds that then fund that system, which are separate. And then you've got special revenue funds, which are in different departments come up as line items that are revenues from specific taxes and fees designed to finance a specific function. So the one that I can think of off the top of my head is the house share tax, right? So that's your Airbnb tax. Those funds are dedicated for gender-based violence solutions and addressing that, right? Or your cannabis tax. Your cannabis tax is 3% on cannabis sales. Those typically go for kind of like social justice initiatives and helping to address injustices by folks who have faced them as a result of like the past quote unquote drug wars, right? They're specifically for those funds. They're mandated for that. They're legislated for that. And so that's what they're there for. And then you've got grant funds. That's money coming from the federal, state, local agencies, sometimes private organizations. I guess the biggest example last year, and it's something that folks were obviously top of mind, was a lot of the migrant mission. So there were hundreds of millions of dollars that people were saying, these are all, what's going on, it's all being spent. A large majority of it was actually passed through funds from grants from the federal and state government. The federal and state government said, we're giving you this amount of money to deal with this issue. And so it's specifically funneled for that. And so the grant funds often have very precise ways that you can spend. The ARPA funds, right? The federal funds to deal with COVID also have specific guidelines of how they can and can't be used. Those would be examples of that. Next slide. All right, now those are different kind of categories, but this is next, what kind of revenue we should prioritize or how we think of that revenue. The thing you'll hear folks talk about are structural revenue versus one-time revenue. So I'll try to make this as simple as we can. Structural revenue is recurring revenue. It's something that you kind of bake in year over year, like your property tax, your garbage haul fees, some of the things that are being thrown around as thought of, like your personal computing, your streaming. Those are things that year over year would be kind of there as revenue streams, right? One-time fees or something like the ARPA money. ARPA money is going to run out at the end of 2026. So if we were to use those funds to cover a gap, it would help, but it wouldn't be there for the following year when the deficit is still around. The reason why those things are important is when you think about the credit rating agencies, right? They look and see how governments are functioning. And if they feel that what we're doing isn't responsible or it could lead to larger risk, they can downgrade the way they grade our financial status in a way that makes it harder to bond, to borrow money, to be in better position financially in the future. So what the rating agencies have said most recently is that they want to see more structural revenue or else we'll get a downgrade in this budget cycle. So when we're talking through these revenue streams, that's what we mean as far as structural. Your one-time, or just what it sounds like, your one-time, not recurring, potentially grants that you can't count on year over year, considering the deficit is going to continue. And then you think about progressive versus regressive revenues, right? So progressive revenues, the way to think of them is you have folks who have more, who can pay their fair share compared to folks who don't and are struggling. And because the same flat fee impacts people differently, a progressive revenue source takes into account how it proportionally affects someone. Largely, the city doesn't really have progressive sources of revenue. Municipalities are kind of limited. The state has more of the ability to do some of it through like how it taxes services, income tax, and such. There were two basically ballot measures that were looking to increase and create progressive revenue, one at the state level, one at the city level. At the state level, it was the fair tax or the graduated tax, which based on somebody's level of income would have a different percentage on what that share of a tax payment would be. But because Chicagoans actually did well, but because most of the state heard the word tax, that was voted down, which leads to a flat tax across the board, which actually yields less revenue over the long run. At the city level, the Bring Chicago Home ordinance or referendum was something similar, where they were looking to get a small margin of tax on transactions of real estate. And they were looking at properties that were $1 million or more, right? That way, if you had a property $1 million or more and you were looking to sell, there would be a margin there. If you actually were selling something less than $1 million, you were saving and it was going to be less taxes for you. But because I believe the city and Mayor Johnson did not do a thorough job of explaining to people what they would do with the funds, that effectively was voted down also. So what you're looking at, the city has as levers to get revenue are regressive forms of revenue. They're kind of flat across the board. So whether you're making $45,000 a year or $300,000 a year, it's the same amount, and it does impact people differently. What had been thought of as being the least regressive of those had been the property tax, because if somebody owns property that's worth more and it's based on the cost of that property, it becomes more proportional. But what we all know, and you all know, is just because your property has increased in value doesn't mean that you're making any more, and you're not selling the property to see a yield or a return. So that becomes challenging when you're managing those funds. And so just to kind of get a background about property taxes, which are a structural form of revenue, but we do have to think about all the different taxes that are being talked about and who they're impacting. Next slide. So appropriation, the money that goes out. So a lot of it's personnel spending on city workforce, right? Your streets and sand workers, the folks that are out there with the snow plows, right? That's being paid for. Your police officers, fire department, your public safety, also your admin in the city government, right? Who takes care of the finances? Who's making sure that people's benefits are all being recorded and are doing well? Those are also the same one. Then when you're thinking about different programs as well. This is my son Parker. Parker, I'm in a meeting. Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. And then finance general, which is dealing with citywide funds, benefits, and such, as well as the pension and debt. So pension, I think we all know we've got some slides that'll cover some of that. So if you want to go to the next slide. All right. So city services depend on revenue. The highest spending departments are often the ones that neighbors depend on the most. CPD is the largest expenditure. You're looking at over 40% of the corporate fund is basically what we're spending on. It takes up a large amount. There's also the Department of Transportation. That's a large, high spending one, but it's less reliant on the corporate fund. They're funded by grants in a way, right? There's federal grants that are infrastructure grants. So when you're thinking about bike lanes, your bump outs, those are largely funded by grants from the federal government that spread across the whole nation, making sure that these improvements are happening. So they're not drawing from like the tax revenue the way other things are. When we're thinking about revenue, the other side of the coin is finding efficiencies and cuts. And so when we are looking at that, we're trying to figure out programmatically, where can you save money? On personnel, how can you save money? And what's the impact if you are cutting back service, right? If you're having furloughs, if you're cutting back staff, are you then going to see less services as it relates to kind of the bread and butter issues? Considering you're paying the same amount of taxes or potentially more, not having the same level of service actually leads to a whole lot of pushback, discontent, and a breaking point. So you do have to take that into account as well as the fact that a lot of the positions are union represented, meaning there's labor contracts in place that kind of have, to be frank, some level of control about what is possible there. So that's what we're looking at. what are the different efficiencies, what's possible, what non-labor efficiencies are available, and in conversation with labor, what is something that can be agreed to. And so that's how you end up trying to figure out your appropriation side of the coin. Next slide. This is the pension. So, pensions, for those who, just to clarify, are benefits. You're talking about city workers who have really been of service to the rest of the city. And because they don't get Social Security, depending on the roles and such, this is how they, once they retire, are being made right. And so a lot of times people talk about pensions, but they don't really understand what about the pension is causing these large deficits. Let's just be frank. The reason why we're at where we are is because past administrations for decades were not making payments. They weren't raising property taxes. They weren't paying on the pension payments. They were looking to borrow funds then when they had to catch up to make those payments, and then led to more mismanagement, right? So as the gap gets bigger, you end up with a city where the decision is made to sell off the parking meters for $1 billion on the front end, but you sold it off for 72 years of revenue you could have gotten. Why? Because you needed to solve a gap in one budget. So when you think about that level of mismanagement, the parallel I always tell folks, it's like you maxed out your credit card and your interest is continuing to rise and you're not paying off any of it. So it's getting worse and worse. The amount that you're owing is more than you spent in the first place or wanted to use. And then when you're trying to pay it back, you're not even paying down to the minimum or to knock out your principal amount. You're just trying to pay back interest as it continues to grow, and it keeps spiraling into a problem. So when you look at the graph that's on the slide right now, this shows you kind of the incline. And we're talking, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars where it continues to add up. But what I wanted to make clear is the reason why we're here isn't because of the pensions. It's not because of the benefits. It's not because of people working who are getting benefits. It is because of past mismanagement and interest that continues to rise. So when you look at this graph, the thing that I want folks to take away at is to look at the red versus the yellow. The red is the actual cost of the benefits. The yellow is the interest. It continues to rise and you're not even making enough of a dent over time to bring it down. So there are mandated payments that the city has to do per the state to make sure we're on any level of keeping it solvable over the next 30 to 50 years. And so just wanted to make sure that people have an understanding of why every single year there's these deficits that are hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion, or why we're talking about making advanced pension payments, because that's the whole ball game. That's the biggest problem that we're looking to solve. And it's something that was created over time. It's also why I'm so dogged whenever somebody mentions trying to take out high interest short-term loans to solve any kind of debt. You're just adding more to this problem. Next slide. So this is just this is an accurate ranking of Chicago's pensions versus other cities as a percentage of how much of it is funded, right? So you've got all the way up to 100%. And so if you look at the city all the way to the right, that is the best. I can't tell what city that is because it's a little, blurry on my end.
DC, District of Columbia, and
Gotta
they've
love
got
that.
federal funds.
And if you go all the way to the left, right, the dark blue, those are Chicago. So that's your CPD benefits, your FOP benefits. I think your laborers are in there as well, and other city employees. They are the lowest when you're comparing it to all, again, because of the mismanagement. So just to give you a scale of how serious these problems are year over year. Next slide. All right, so this is, like I mentioned before, about the credit upgrades and downgrades. So under Lori Lightfoot, we got to give credit where it's due. No pun intended. The ratings have continued to get better. We have seen a number of them over time. I think there were 2 upgrades so far under Johnson as well, where things are kind of moving in the right direction. As stated here, moving in that direction saves billions of dollars in future pension costs, because you're able to then, I think a question came up, I think Kathy might have asked it. It then allows you to talk to the banks and be in better position to find solutions. But if you're drowning in all this debt and not making the right decisions, if you're not doing the structural revenue, you're being downgraded, and it becomes much, much harder to actually figure it out and becomes more expensive in the long run. Next slide. So kind of the property tax bill, like I mentioned, it's not just a city tax when you're looking at property tax, although people kind of lump them all together. Chicago actually represents 1/5 of the total property tax bill. What you're seeing is CPS, which is its own tax. Some of the, again, the pension debt that's being covered, and some of that's at the state level as well. And other things that affect it are your reassessments. So when you're looking at like this the pancake of taxes that you all look at as one tax, just want you to understand that the Chicago tax is really a fraction of that. But there are these other things that we know people feel, right? When CPS, which by the state is only allowed to raise a tax either up to the consumer price index, so by inflation year over year, or 5%, whichever one is lower, they're going to raise it to the max because they've got to pay their own pension payments and their own services and headcount. So that's when you'll see there. Pension debt is something that affects multiple levels of government, and the reassessments, as you all know, because the taxes are kind of moving around as far as the levy, because depending how properties are valued, whether they're business or residential, whether it's downtown or other areas, all of those shifts to try to figure out how to cover a tax levy, which is the amount you've got to pay year over year either way, do have effect really on everyone's bottom line. Next. So how are city property taxes spent? So that, again, they fund the services that aren't grant related. So a lot of the public safety, streets and sand, these here, the slides kind of show some of where the funds go generally. I think the one on the right is actually really good to identify and kind of get a sense of what percentage goes to what. So if you look at your general financing requirements, right, these are things that are kind of, again, required, that's there. If you look at your public safety, that's how much a lot of the corporate fund is going towards in comparison to things like finance and administration or infrastructure costs. So it's just things to think about when we are talking about management. How do you bring the cost down? Next. How does inflation impact property taxes? I mean, as we all know, the consumer property index, or inflation itself, continues to rise. The cost of services rise, the cost of labor rises. So there's the cost always goes up. And in situations like we've seen recently, inflation can actually shoot up tremendously, like after like COVID and watching how governments have looked to address it. So something that Mayor Lightfoot did last term, which was a really good move, was establishing a structural revenue when it came to property tax by indexing it to inflation, right? Because if you're paying the same amount all the time, but your costs are going up, you're actually creating more of a deficit there. What Lightfoot did is, if she adjusted it so every year by inflation, it would go up along with cost, it better measures what the cost increase is in a way that is much more responsible to do. But because a lot of it is legislative, there is the option to pause or skip those. And so what we saw is the last time that CPI inflation adjusted tax was actually included was in 2022. Now, the reason why that didn't occur after are largely political, right? A mayor heading into re-election doesn't want to vote for a tax, so they vote to pause it so they don't have to do it as they're heading into re-election campaigning. And then what happened the year after that is Mayor Johnson got elected, said he was not going to raise property taxes as a campaign promise. I'll put an asterisk there and say that's not a campaign promise anyone should make, but apparently it's what he did. So then the first year in office, even though that could have been the CPI index tax could have been included, what he said was, well, we're not going to do that because I said I wasn't going to raise property taxes. I will note, last year when that occurred, I did talk to the administration and say, I think you're going to cause a problem if you don't keep it on, because if you remove it, you're only creating a larger deficit in the next year. So that would have been something like 60 to 70 million that year. But because you don't have that, it becomes a larger deficit this year. Now, the other logic behind doing the only reason, the other thing to think about when it comes to adjusting it for inflation, sorry, it took me a second, is that again, if you're not doing it, you're creating a larger deficit. So we believe that you have to maintain that in order to keep that kind of cost in place. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. All right, so
So
we
I
want to
can-
get into kind of the survey, and so I'm going to pass it off to Allison to kind of talk through some of the feedback we got from neighbors.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to first thank everyone so much for your feedback. I think this is some of the highest engagement we've ever seen on a survey at the 40th Ward. We got around 500 responses from people, and it's been really, really helpful for us to read through your ideas, get a sense of where everybody is landing on things. So a few things I wanted to just highlight. The first is we had people kind of rank choice vote what are their highest priority things in terms of how they want budget money to be spent. The top 3 in the 40th Ward were on public safety. So that's things like CPD, emergency response, fire department, on housing. So that includes both new housing, affordable housing, and also addressing issues like homelessness, and on infrastructure. So repairing our streets, sidewalks, alleys, things like that. So those are our top 3 priorities in the 40th Ward, and that's kind of helped us shape some of what we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail today. I also wanted to highlight some of the things that people mentioned in terms of how can Chicago improve, because that's also something we always want to think about during a budget process. That's what comes up a lot in these hearings are we're about to pass a budget for all of these departments. We want to make sure that those departments are performing, that they're providing the service that folks are paying for. So we had a lot of folks submit ideas for service improvement. And in terms of general themes where people want to see more money invested, certainly public safety came up. Transit improvements came up, which is CTA in general as an agency is a different budget. So that's not covered through this budget, but that is a definite priority of folks in the 40th Ward. Bike, pedestrian, and traffic safety, also a major one that people mentioned, as well as addressing homelessness and building more affordable housing and fixing stuff, fixing our streets, fixing how construction is done so projects are better coordinated and you're not having a situation where you have a nice new sidewalk and then people's gas comes and tears it up the next week because they have a project. So those are some of the things that you all mentioned that you want to see in terms of priorities and service improvements. So we're going to give it over to Geoffrey now, who's going to kind of give you, now that we've talked a little bit about broadly, how do budgets work? What are the kinds of things that are informing this budget? Geoffrey's going to take us through the actual budget, what it looks like, and we're going to focus in on a couple of the departments that folks particularly wanted to hear more about. So Geoffrey, take it away.
All righty, thanks very much. I think you can skip the next couple. The next one's just going to be my introduction. Oh, an overview of where we're going. Great. Go ahead and go to the next one. One more. All right, brilliant. Here we are. Andre or Alderman Vasquez already went over some of this stuff, but you know, just to be clear on when we talk about the budget and what the older people are negotiating right now, I think it's very important to remember that the budget gives you a picture, but it is not a complete picture. It is going to say how much each department is budgeting and what they are budgeting it for. It's going to tell you how many positions they are looking to hire, they are authorized to hire. If you do a little work with the spreadsheets, you can get full-time employee equivalents out of the hourly and monthly positions as well. And the data sets that the city releases when it releases a proposed budget will tell you their estimated revenues, how much they're thinking they're going to get from their local funds. The grant funds, they don't make available as a data set. You can only get those through the PDF grant supplement, which I linked in one of the answers in the Q&A. But what the budget does not have in it is any kind of operational detail. You know, it's not making assignments of personnel. It's not saying what tasks individual workers are going to do. It's not setting the actual staffing levels. It's setting a maximum number of hires for each given title, each position that exists. But those are budgeted, not filled. And what we know from this budget and from previous ones where they've eliminated some positions to make the budget balance, a lot of those positions do sit vacant and then just get used as placeholders or eliminated to save some money in the budget. And by and large, the budget's not going to tell you a simple programmatic, we spent X number of dollars on Y program. There's a few exceptions. There are a handful of programs that just get their own line item, but by and large, it's a somewhat more complicated picture of looking at staffing, building, operational, supply, a bunch of different costs that fall under different appropriation accounts when you're trying to create a whole dollar answer of something like, How much does the city spend on homelessness relief? How much did the city spend on migrant services? The budget can give you part of that picture, but it's not going to give you quite as neat of an answer as we sometimes want it to. Let's go to the next one. So just the big picture overview compared to last year, we're up about 2.2% in appropriations, we're down about 2% in positions, and we're up about 2.5% in our estimated revenues. And the next couple slides are going to give us more detail on all of these. Starting with the appropriations. So this is a historical comparison just to give you an idea of how budgets have grown in Chicago's recent history. This year I said 2.2% growth. Last year was 1.3, so we're up a little bit. Budget got a little bigger this year than it did last year. That average from 2011 to 2024, that 8.5%, that's a lot, right? That's growing usually faster than inflation if you're growing at 8.5 yearly, but it's worth keeping in mind most of that comes from the tail end of this graph. Most of that is going to come when COVID relief funds start rolling in and the budget gets bigger because it has hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funds in it. So a more helpful benchmark for comparison, I think, is look at the pre-pandemic budgets, which is 2011 through 2020. The pandemic hits in 2020, but the 2020 budget, remember, was passed in 2019 before we knew the pandemic was coming, before there were any federal funds in the picture. So for that time period, the city budget's going up about 5% annually. If you adjust it for inflation, it's 3.5%. So we're relatively close to that, and we're below that with our 2.2%. A couple of things that have made those jumps. We're gonna, when you look at this chart here, you have two different colors of bars. There's the departmental appropriations, so that's the budget each given department has to work with, all added up. And then the red part of the bar is what the city calls finance general, which is its non-departmental sort of catch-all category for citywide expenses. And a thing that Chicago does that a lot of budget people wish they wouldn't do is they lump pension and benefits costs into finance general. So when we say, how much are we spending on staff at the police department or at CFD or at CDOT, the salaries and wages go into the departmental appropriation. The pensions and benefits go into finance general and get lumped in with all the others. So when you look at the chart, you're going to see a couple moments in history where the budgets jump more than you would expect them to. You're going to see them when we go from 2015 to 2016. Finance general gets a lot bigger. There's that leap of about $500 million. That's as the city enters what were called the pension ramps. Without getting into too much history, that was sort of the baby first step of getting ourselves back onto some path towards actually paying off the pension. So prior to that, prior to 2016's budget, there is no question the city is not paying the amount of money it needs to get its pension solvent. 2015, the ramp starts, so we are making more payments than we used to. We're still not actually paying what we need to be, but we start making progress. And then you're going to see it 2019 and 2021 is when different pension funds make the leap from the so-called ramps to actuarially calculated payments, where there is math being done to say this is how much you got to spend to get yourself back on track, and you have to make that minimum payment. So you see the finance general appropriation jump a lot there. And then, of course, 2021 is where it starts, but especially 2022 and 2023 and onward, that's where federal pandemic funds have rolled in. And there you see the department budgets jump. And that's because departments like Family and Support Services, Department of Public Health, departments that were doing pandemic relief things, they get a massive infusion of cash. And it's also where revenue replacement came in. There was the bulk of our ARPA funds just went towards basically saying we're going to put this money into the budget because we didn't raise revenue during the pandemic because things were closed down. And the way the city chose to handle that was they included it as part of the department budget for the Office of Budget and Management. So you have what is normally a very small department with a budget for, accountants and some software, all of a sudden has billions of dollars in it because it's taking on that revenue replacement. So those are sort of the three inflection points where you see the big jumps that then, if you just look at the average, takes you to that 8.5% annual number. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to just zoom in a little bit on each part. So that first slide was everything. That was finance general plus departments. This is just departmental appropriations. Public safety departments, because they're the biggest and take up the biggest chunk of the budget, we break those out, and then we do all of the other departments. So that blue bar on the left side, that is Chicago Police Department, Chicago Fire Department, Office of Emergency Management and Communications, and in the last few years, the new Office of Public Safety Administration. The red bar is everything else, 30 odd departments, depending on which year you're in, doing everything else in the city. And then we'll zoom in one more time and break down that public safety chunk of the chart for you too, just because I know that's where a lot of the interest and focus is every year. That shows you the breakdown and the proportions between those departments: CPD in blue, CFD in red, emergency management and communications in yellow, and then the new Office of Public Safety Administration those last few years in green. So you get the sense, CPD is the largest chunk of public safety is the largest chunk of the departments, and then the departments in finance general have fluctuated over the years as to what takes up the bigger chunk of the budget. Next slide. Positions. So this is the number of titles and FTE equivalent or full-time equivalents that the city is authorized to hire. It's held relatively stable on the whole over the years. It fluctuates some year to year, but if you're looking at the scale on that right hand, we're moving less than about 0.2% in terms of the entire city's workforce up and down over the course of all of these decades. So you get some fluctuation year to year, but the city's workforce is so large that it all in the big picture comes out relatively similar. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And one more. Okay, the pie chart's helpful just to give you a sense of how big some of these pieces are and how small the rest of the pieces are. These are revenues. This is how much the city is saying we think we are going to take in from things. The biggest slice up there, the totals from rates and charges, that's airport revenue. Those are the rates and charges at Midway and O'Hare. So as the alderman mentioned, those are pretty much self-contained. They stay and fund the operations of Department of Aviation, but they don't really go towards other departments. So your biggest piece of the revenue pie that most of our departments rely on is the property tax levy. Now, the chart we have up there, this is from the original budget proposal. So this was when we were having that $350 million increase. That's potentially not going to happen. The $350 million is not going to happen. 50 older people voted that down. So whatever the actual property tax levy ends up being, it'll be a smaller part of that pie, which means they'll need to either cut appropriations or raise other revenues to make up for whatever portion of that goes away. And one of the things that has been floated, that lease of personal property tax down there, that's the 5.1%. The chunk of that is on cloud services is something that's been floated to raise, which would bump that up. So they are looking to basically increase the amount that they get from one of their other largest slices of revenues, would make up a decent chunk of that. But really, again, the important part of this slide is the perspective. It's that set aside the airports, your property tax levy is a huge chunk of what the city relies on, and everything else only makes up about half of what the city relies on. Next slide. A little bit of a picture here of where some of the pain points in this year's budget are and where some of the relief in this budget is as well. The property tax levy obviously got the biggest increase from last year. The rates and charges, that's the airport again, that had a big jump from last year. The interest income is a rare good story in the budget. That's just, we were calculating what we expected to get from some of our investments using one formula that wasn't terribly accurate. They changed the formula. They have a more accurate picture, and happily that more accurate picture means a little more money in the coffers. So that's sort of the rare piece of good news in a budget where you say, oops, we found more money. Unfortunately, you look at the other half of the screen there, and the deficits, the things that we're raising less money on this year, are a lot more severe. That bottom one, the biggest drop off, that's in what's essentially the state corporate income tax. The state changed how corporations could declare profits and losses. So is the state, as a result, is taking in less income tax from corporate entities, and the city's share of it is correspondingly smaller. That's actually where a lot of the pain this year is coming from. And you see it rolling over into some of those other revenues directly above it. The corporate fund is getting less money from the state, and so things that we would normally pay into from the corporate fund get a smaller share. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. This is non-grant revenue, so we're not taking a look at grants, but just to give you an idea of which funds got the biggest jumps this year and which took the biggest loss. Airport is looking good. Policemen's annuity got a decent infusion of cash. The emergency communication fund, which goes toward OEMC and OPSA primarily, those all got nice little bumps. But you look down at the bottom of it, and again, you see where a lot of this year's budget pain is coming from. The corporate fund is down $38.8 million, and that's the most fungible pot of money we have, the most flexible pot of money we have, and it's what a lot of departments rely on. If we go to the next slide, I think next slide should be the department breakdown. Let's see. Yes, perfect. I'm glad that one's next. So this is just to give you an idea of how important that corporate fund is. Don't worry if you can't see all of the details on your screen. The important thing is how much of the bar is bright blue. The bright blue is the corporate fund. So you can see a number of our departments are entirely corporate funded, and many other departments are primarily corporate funded. So when you take a hit to that part of the budget, everything else gets correspondingly harder. The only budgets that really can do their own thing independent of fluctuations in the corporate fund are going to be water management, which has the water and sewer taxes, cultural affairs, which has the hotel and the entertainment taxes, the public library, which has its own levies, and then Department of Aviation, which has the airport funds. Go ahead and go to the next one. This is just basically the same information in a different format, showing you how many of the departments are really entirely dependent on the corporate fund, how many use a lot of the corporate fund, but have their own sources as well, and how many are primarily self-funded. Next slide. And again. All right, here's where the money's going. This is this year's proposed budget broken down by department. So you can see CPD at the top, the largest department in terms of appropriation, and it's also the largest that is primarily corporate funded. CDOT and Department of Aviation are the next largest, but they are primarily grant and self-funded. So it's really CPD, Department of Family and Support Services, and then CFD are your three biggest that are drawing on the corporate fund. Go ahead and go to the next one. And I think we should have the net change. Yep, there we go. So this is how much did the actual real dollars go up or down? CDOT, that's again almost entirely grant funded. Department of Aviation, that's primarily their own revenues. CPD gets the biggest increase in funding out of the corporate fund. Down at the bottom of the chart there, the departments where you're seeing huge reductions, those are departments that received a lot of ARPA funding. That's your Department of Health, Department of Planning and Development. Those took a big hit. Those were relying a lot on ARPA funds and will now have less in the coming year. So they're making some hard choices about what programs to continue and what to not. Next slide. This is the percent rather than the net. So how big of a proportional gain or hit did the department take? Again, you can see CDOT, Department of Aviation, both up at the top there still, and down at the bottom again, DPD, CDPH, and then the other one down there, OBM, that's the one I mentioned earlier. That's Office of Budget and Management that was doing the revenue replacement under ARPA. What it all goes toward, just to give you the biggest pictures here, salaries and wages, biggest by far. And then employee annuity and benefit, that's your pensions and benefits. The thing in between them, the reserve balance, is grant funds. And the reason it looks so large is OBM changed how they were accounting for that. So those were things that showed up in a different part of the budget last year. So they look like a whole bunch of money got added to the budget this year. But really what that is grant funds that are going to be used this year that may or may not have originated this year. A lot of them are, grants are not tied to a specific fiscal year. You get them and then the money rolls over. The reserve balance is that. So that's a slice of the pie you cannot pay as much attention to. The real takeaway here is that your salaries and wages and your annuity and benefits are more than a quarter of the budget. So when you talk about cutting anything else, it's really nibbling around the edges compared to personnel costs. One more. There you go. This is just the big picture of how many people the city's planning to employ in this current budget. CPD, obviously far and away the largest. It's about 40% of the workforce, just under 40% of the workforce. CFD, the next largest, and everything else substantially smaller there. And you see how quickly it drops off, how we really do have 3 or 4 departments that make up the bulk of the city's employees, and everything else is relatively small change compared to it. Next slide. Same information, just in a pie chart to show you the proportions. Important takeaway there, I think, is really CPD and CFD. That's more than half your workforce. So when you start talking about anything that's going to get savings out of the workforce, you'll hear people say we got to make changes to the workforce, but exempt fire and police. And we understand where that's coming from, but folks got to understand you've just exempted more than half of the budget. Like you've just exempted more than half of the problem you're trying to solve there. So it makes everything else that much harder. Next slide. This is the net change, how many positions the city is adding or eliminating to departments. The mayor's been pretty clear and city council's been pretty clear. These are just vacancies at this point. No layoffs have been announced or proposed or planned right now. So they are cutting positions that were budgeted last year, but either didn't get filled last year or were filled and then became vacant. Someone retired, the position changed, whatever. That's how these positions became vacant, and that's what they're cutting out of the budget. And the next slide should just show it proportionally. You can see, even though CPD takes the biggest cut in terms of number of positions, it's only about a 3% change to the actual department because it has such a large headcount. The biggest proportional cut actually at our Technology and Innovation Department, our IT department, and then at Department of Public Health is the next one taking the next largest hit. And that's it for that section of it. The contact info is up there, and I assume the slide deck is going to be available after as well. So we'll do Q&A on this, but obviously if anyone feels the need to reach out or if there are any questions that I can't answer on the call, feel free to download that, screenshot that, write it down, whatever. I'm more than happy to answer via phone and email as well.
This will also come back up right at the end, but I wanted to shift us quickly into some specific budgets that people indicated they wanted to hear more about. So when we asked about this in our survey, the two budgets that people most wanted to learn more about were public safety and transportation. So Geoffrey's going to take us through just a quick snapshot of what both of those proposed budgets look like for this year. And then Alder Vasquez in our office is going to talk a little bit more through like what are we looking at there? Why do those budgets look the way they do? And what are some of the things that we are trying to lay the groundwork for those departments? So let's start with CDOT.
All righty, and just the snapshot there. I mentioned at the start, I think we do snapshots of each department ahead of their hearing. So if you want to dive way deeper into any of the departments, just go to the bettergov.org website and you'll find similar data to this in a much longer form. But the short picture of CDOT is the budget is up considerably. You're more than 1/3 increase in the budget, but a slight decrease. You can see that. Oh, sorry. We're on CDOT, not CBD. Sorry, a 37.3% increase there, and a slight decrease in the headcount. And the next slide will show you where some of that's coming from. So these are, I only put the numbers on the biggest chunks of the bar there, but just to give you a sense of the perspective there, CDOT is really heavily grant funded and has become more so in recent years. And that's because there's been a fair amount of federal and state infrastructure grant money that's become available. And the city's taking advantage of that. So to get a really comprehensive picture of what CDOT has money for and what they are budgeted for, you have to dive into that grant detail book that I mentioned that they only make available as the PDF. It's not a data set that we can work with and easily get categories of appropriations out for you. So it's a little harder to paint a really detailed picture, but for the people who want that detailed picture, you're going to want to go to the grant book and dive into CDOT's section on that, and you'll be able to see what these federal and state grants are. And if you want to, you can go onto the city's procurement portal and look up the grants themselves and pull exactly what they can and can't be used for. It's a pretty deep rabbit hole you can go down if you want to. Next slide. There you go. Some good perspective on just how dramatically this has increased in recent years. CDOT has gotten more aggressive about seeking grants, but also the grants that are available have just become much, much bigger, both at the federal and the state level. And that's why you're seeing the increase there. The appropriations, again, that top one is the reserve balance. That's grant rollovers, so it doesn't tell you a whole lot programmatically, but setting that aside, CDOT's unusual. Most departments' biggest expenses are all personnel related. CDOT is an exception. They spend most of their money on the general category of construction, which can include a bunch of different appropriations and a bunch of different expenses underneath it. And then that professional and technical services appropriation is the city's outside contracting. Whenever you see that, that is someone who is not a city worker being paid to do work on behalf of the city. Next slide. The budgeted workforce there, like I said, a slight decrease this year, but you can see it has been climbing over time. The overall trend is still upward despite a small decrease in headcount this year. And I don't think I put a slide in for it, but just to say it from doing the snapshot earlier today, the decrease in headcount is primarily laborers. It's asphalt and concrete laborers and motor truck drivers, pool drivers. So it's 3 or 4 positions each from a couple of different titles in the laborer and driver titles. Go ahead.
So part of the reason that we thought these two, thankfully they were the two that people most wanted to talk about, but I also think CDOT and CPD make a really good kind of bookend comparison because they're the ones that people ask about more often, and they also function really differently. So some of the things that we heard about in the survey were either like, stop doing certain transportation projects or do more transportation projects, and that'll solve the budget. And to Geoffrey's point earlier, I think while this can feel really in the weeds, it's important to, if you're looking for the budget and seeing that CDOT's budget has gone up, that's absolutely true. But most of that is because of these large state and federal infrastructure grants. So the bipartisan infrastructure law is one really large one that comes from the federal government, and then Rebuild Illinois that comes from the state. Rebuild Illinois, you can see a little bit of the funding breakdown that's going towards in Chicago specifically over there on the right. This was a huge bill that was passed by the state to address the crumbling infrastructure throughout a lot of Illinois. So this is good that we have this big infusion of cash. Same goes with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was meant to address areas that really haven't gotten a lot of investment and places that badly need repair, also fund some safety projects. So just important to keep in mind when you're looking at CDOT is that budget has gone up, which is great, but a lot of that is grant funded and meant to kind of like catch up on infrastructure repairs that haven't maybe been as much prioritized over the last few years. And it's not reliant on the corporate fund, which is more what we're talking about when we're talking about things like property tax increases and things like that. So next we're going to talk about CPD.
Okay, and again, just the snapshot there, the budget is up, headcount is down. Let's go ahead and do the next one and dive a little deeper into both of those. This is all the public safety departments. I just threw those up for comparison so you can see most of them taking a change in position. Most of those are cuts. OEMC is the only one that added a few positions. Overall, citywide public safety position headcount is down 2.2%. Citywide, the reduction is about 2%, so pretty comparable there. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of, again, where the money comes from, CPD and CFD, those blue bars are the corporate fund. OEMC, that green one that you can see the biggest sliver of, that's that emergency communications fund we talked about. And that's a telephone and communication surcharge that's been around for many, many years. You know, it was originally used to fund 911 operations and is still used to fund OEMC, and now also to some extent the Office of Public Safety Administration. But your two big corporate fund drawing public safety departments are CPD and CFD. There's the appropriation just for the police department over time. So you can see how it's climbing. The net appropriation keeps getting larger. It has dropped as a portion of the overall city budget. And that's particularly true once we get to the pandemic, because you had those departments that got hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in ARPA funds. And CPD was not one of those. They didn't receive ARPA funds. So the denominator got a lot larger is basically what happened there. And what CPD pays for, what that appropriation goes for, overwhelmingly personnel costs. Just far and away personnel costs. It's salaries and wages, and then it's a number of other personnel related expenses, the overtime, salary provision, which is a payment officers can get for working when they weren't originally scheduled to work, scheduled salary adjustments. Those are the raises, including the ones that got increased in the last FOP contract, which is the bulk of CPD's workforce, fringe benefits. You know, there's a bunch of stuff on this chart, and it's all personnel. And the other thing to remember here is that this is also not including the pensions and benefits. Those are getting lumped under finance general. So you can take the entire CPD appropriation and multiply it by about another third or so, and that gets you a little closer to what the actual cost of services looks like for this or for any other department. Okay, biggest changes this year, salaries and wages go up considerably, and again, that is in large part because the FOP contract gave much larger raises than were in place in previous years. Professional and technical services is the biggest drop, so there's a lot less outside contracting budgeted at CPD this year, which is always heartening to see. The city has a long-standing problem with outside contracting. We spend a lot on it, and it's often very hard to see what we're getting for it. So a number of departments, including CPD, made cuts to that particular line item this year, and that was heartening to see. Next slide. Overall workforce, you can see a slight decrease over time, and a decrease as well in the percentage of the total city workforce. It's was up to about 43 or 44%, during the Rahm Emanuel years, and has dropped to right around 40% currently. Just to take a look at some of the reductions that are being planned, so the positions that are being eliminated, and again, remember, it's not layoffs, they're getting rid of positions. We sorted it a couple different ways in the snapshot that you can see online, but one of the more useful ways to sort it is by bargaining unit, because that tells you a decent snapshot of how many of these are uniformed officers that you might expect to see on the streets versus how many are other workers in the department. And the largest cuts are to AFSCME, which is non-uniformed workers, and to the exempt and non-represented. So those are folks either who are not a member of the union at all, or that's your command staff. That's people who have been uniformed officers and are still uniformed police, but they have risen above the rank of captain. Now those are your management, so they're no longer under the union contract. Those are where the biggest cuts are, both net and proportion. And then Fraternal Order of Police, which is the rank and file officers, is the next after that at a smaller level. SEIU, IBEW, again, that's corrections officers. That's people who are doing staffing detention, but who are not uniformed CPD officers. And then down at the bottom, a couple of captain positions also eliminated. And then the next slide should show you the same thing, but by division. So to give you some idea of where these cuts are being made in terms of where the assignments are happening. The Chicago Police Department, that's the catch-all. That includes all the office staff. So that's where a lot of those ASME non-uniform positions are. Patrol Services, that's those FOP positions. That's where the bulk of those are. Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform, I think people have probably seen, there's been news articles about that. That is our department that is trying to handle consent decree and other strategies to make the police department less on the hook for constitutional violations. Eliminating a bunch of positions there is not a good thing, but I think it is helpful perspective to keep in mind that those are vacancies. Those are positions that were never filled. So it's not quite so much an issue of we're cutting the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform to the bone, as it is we never really fully funded or staffed the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform in the first place. And then you can see the smaller cuts going down from there, as well as the ones that didn't get any cuts. Next slide.
So Alder Vasquez, I thought you could take this one just to kind of break down some of what we are looking at with the biggest department, and yeah, take it away.
Yeah, and I appreciate Geoffrey. Thank you so much for presenting on kind of the differences and some similarities between CDOT and CPD. I think when we're looking at when people are saying we're spending too much, really looking to see where that lion's share of spending is going is, I think, something that needs to be talked about, because it's a very real conversation. And so seeing that CDOT is a large expenditure but covered by grants, where CPD is a large expenditure but covered largely, almost wholly, by the corporate fund, we are thinking about how you solve for the fact that the costs continue to rise. And so when you think about that, there's a number of things that lead to that cost. Overtime is a humongous one. So $293 million were spent just on CPD overtime alone. Now, here's something that I'd like to address, because we hear it a lot. Well, if you hire more cops, then you should bring down the overtime. That's actually not occurred. You hire more officers and they're all being overworked. So the overtime continues to rise, right? We definitely saw a lot of it during COVID, but even before, you've got officers working, 18-hour shifts. They're working weeks without taking days off. They're mandated to not take days off depending on certain situations. And so the fact that they're being worked to the bone, really, one, increases your overtime. Two, isn't good for the health and well-being of those officers, and makes it harder for them making judgment calls in very tense situations. So that's something to think about. Now, when you think about overtime, the other thing is what we're asking police to do. Now, I firmly believe, and I've said this publicly, that when you think about police, I view their core functions as really three things. It's investigations, apprehension, and emergency response when it's appropriate. Now, we call them for those things, but in addition to that, we call them for somebody who's homeless, somebody with mental health issues, someone's substance use issues, someone's parking in a spot they shouldn't be parking. We call on them for event security. All these things that I don't believe they should be the ones we're calling them. They shouldn't be the ones we're calling for. We're still calling them, and that is leading to more hours, and it's spreading them thin from what their core functions should be. And that's a clear problem. Something that we've learned in this budget, for example, related to overtime, is when you've got them working events, Lollapalooza, NASCAR, events of that sort, CPD actually doesn't weigh in on the contracts with those event holders. So they can't say, hey, we can't even do that. You're going to have to get your own security to do it. They're not able to weigh in until after the agreements have already been signed, right? And in those agreements, those event throwers have to actually reimburse for that overtime. So we asked this year, how much money do we need to be reimbursed in overtime, and how much has been? And so it was $30 million that we are basically owed. And the only amount that's been reimbursed out of that is 1.5 million. So we're not even being reimbursed by the people throwing those events. And so something that I've asked for is to change those agreements to say, you know what? If you don't pay back the money you're supposed to reimburse, you don't get a permit to do another event. Because again, that's not a responsible way to move forward, and it is burning the officers. The other thing to think about is the police misconduct. So historically, really for over 100 years now, CPD, because they have not had the most constitutional policing, and I'm putting that lightly, has led to misconduct case after misconduct case and settlement, right? That number continues to go up. Last term, over the past 10 years before, I'd say from 2019, 10 years back, the average that the city would pay in police misconduct settlements was $100 million a year. That has gone up. This year alone, it has been $150 million a year. Now, how much does the city budget have and is budgeted for misconduct settlements? $82 million. So you only have $82 million budgeted for something that's going to cost double. Those things are problems that need to be resolved, which is why the consent decree positions, right? Those that are being brought in to make sure that we're having more constitutional policing also save us cost in the long run. Now, whenever we talk about settlements, the thing that always comes up, well, we're not trying enough of those cases. Why don't we try them? And every time we settle, we're paying out. We've actually had situations where the city tried it. We had one based on a wrongful conviction where just this year alone, we lost $50 million in one case. So the reason why the city settles is because it says, and the lawyers come and talk to us monthly and say, based on the evidence, if we were to take this to trial, we're going to lose even more money. So we'd much rather settle out for the smaller amount. And that's typically what you're hearing. So just wanted to provide a whole bunch of context as it relates to that. We do have a consent decree by the Federal Department of Justice because they saw how unconstitutional policing was. And so we have to actually get up to speed to that. Now, typically, it takes about 10 years to complete the consent decree requirements and be where you need to be. We are 5 years into the consent decree and we're only 7% completed. So we're behind even on that, and that's a problem. But back to kind of the staffing issue, the overtime being worked. My colleague, Alderman Matt Martin of the 47th Ward kind of led the charge, and we co-sponsored on having the city move forward with a workforce allocation study. So we know how many folks should be staffed where, what work are they doing, what does right look like? Because currently we don't have any of that information. And so that study right now is out for contract to find a vendor basically to do it. And as we get results on that, we'll be reporting back to see what we find. So all those things are different components that we have to look at when we think about CPD. So when we're talking about efficiencies, it really isn't cutting headcount. It's looking at all these other factors that if you actually manage the workforce in the way it could be managed, you would find savings just in doing that properly. Next slide. So based on the fact that we're looking at close to $1 billion deficit just for this year alone, we have to find efficiencies. So the cuts that we're talking about, and again, not a lot of places to go cut that are going to lead to yield to a lot of returns, right? It's going to lead to marginal and figuring out revenue. So this is why Mayor Johnson, in looking at that problem, said, hey, we're not going to do any cuts. We're not going to lay off anybody. We're going to have a $300 million property tax. And that's why the city council looked at it and said, we don't agree with that initial offer. We don't think that's a responsible way to look at things. And if you want anyone to have any level of confidence in that being a proposal, you got to show the homework. And so because the whole city council, 50 members all said, we reject that as a starting point of a conversation, it actually forced the administration to take us seriously on a lot of ideas. So the way, just to give you some little bit inside of baseball, we had a budget hearing the first day with the budget director. We threw out ideas of, hey, here's a revenue idea. Here's a way that you can save some funds. What are we doing with that? And question after question, myself and all of our colleagues were told, here's why that doesn't work. Here's why we couldn't do it. It's not feasible. And that is what led to 50 members of city council saying, if you're not even listening to our ideas, we're shooting yours down. So now that opened up a conversation where all of a sudden, hey, let's talk about the ideas that you alders had. And so some of them are looking at hemp beverage, so your Delta 8, which is largely what's being sold in a lot of stores. Some of it is unhealthy, but in beverage format, there's a healthier way to kind of process it. And so there are conversations about what taxing that could look like. Cloud computing. So cloud computing is something that's nebulous to explain. the way somebody talked to me about it, and we talked to his colleagues, is if a law firm needs a whole bunch of cloud space to save its files, to do all of that above, they would cut a deal with like a Google or someone who provides that level of data cloud computing. And so looking at taxing that in a way that I think it would yield somewhere north of $100 million if it was taxed at, I believe it's like 10.25%. Streaming. Sorry?
It's about a 2% increase from where it's currently at. It's jumping from about 9% to about 11%, raises you about $120 million.
Thank you for that. So, yeah, because if it was 0 to 10, it'd be like, that's crazy. But only the 2% increase yields that amount. Streaming services like your Netflix, the house share surcharge, and that's your Airbnb tax, the garbage haul fee, and I want to talk about garbage haul for a second. So right now, if you were to break it down per unit, your garbage haul, what we pay is about $9.50 per unit, right? Your nearby municipalities are an average of $25 a unit. So we're not even up to where the local municipalities around us are, or up to inflation. But we're also operating at a deficit, meaning we pay for the services, but we're bringing in way less than what we pay for. If we were to actually pay for the services and not be at a deficit, it would be 52 per unit. So there are different conversations about what right might look like. Is it getting us to 20? So it's still lower than like the nearby municipalities, and looking at how much that might yield as well. So that's part of a conversation. Water bottle tax, looking at efficiencies related to the ARPA funds, right? So these one-time funds we got from the federal government, are there things that we can just say we're not going to do? There's like there's to be honest, there's a guaranteed basic income program, there's business grants, there are other things to look at that some members of council are saying, let's not use that money for that, let's use it to cover a hole. And I think that's a fair conversation to have. I think we are going to find some efficiencies there, but again, that's not a recurring structural revenue. That's a one-time fix, so it doesn't solve it year over year, and it's not something the credit agencies would look at and say, okay, that works. Still, I think it's something that should be considered, and I think we will go forward with. And then looking at additional vacancy eliminations, right? So things that haven't even been hired yet, and potential staffing efficiencies. So looking at some of middle management, looking at the mayor's office, looking at other potential either raise freezes or outright efficiencies on there. So things that we're looking at long term, it is looking at like the CPD overtime, as I mentioned. It is doing studies to identify how folks are hiring into those vacancies. It's expanding the Smart Streets pilot, which is the bike lane violations, enforcement. It's looking at the street speed cameras. It's things that aren't taxes, right? If you're not speeding, you're not getting a ticket. But it's also looking at congestion pricing. So this is something where, in the way I've seen it, or I would recommend, is you kind of set up all across the border of the city. So, your off ramps to the highways. If you're coming into the city, there's a fee there that you're paying, like a tollway. And those funds go to like improving the roads, knowing that there's wear and tear when folks from suburbs come in. And so there's ways to kind of model that. So we're really looking to identify over the long run, what are different ways to improve both the revenue you're getting and also the efficiencies. And the one thing that's not mentioned here, but is a big challenge, is that Springfield actually can provide us a lot of levers to actually get more revenue. There's something called the Local Government Distributed Fund, where the state collects all the funds and gives different municipalities about 6%, even though it used to be 10%. It's having those conversations. It's looking at taxing services. What we see is when you're taxing products, they're diminishing return or less revenue over time. But if you're taxing certain services, it's actually going up. But all that, we need state help. And I think as many people have seen, and it has been reported, the relationship between the mayor and the governor and the administration down in Springfield isn't the best, and it's made it much more challenging to get to those kind of agreements, even as we recognize that the state itself next year has a $3 billion deficit coming. Next slide. So the things that I've been looking at and I've been leading on in the council are management ordinance amendments. These are the things that help you process-wise to get better year over year. I'll tell you what's not better. Finding out your budget on October 30th and being told you got to figure out by the end of the year. That's not a way to solve any budget, right? And so in 2020, under Mayor Lightfoot, I proposed back then putting together a budget working group to work on this stuff all year. She said she would do it. She then reneged on the deal. And so since then, we've still been trying to push to get that done. But there are things that we can require of the budget office that would put it in a better position. So the city has a council office of financial analysis, COFA, which is in some regards similar, but way weaker than an independent budget office, right? We're looking to strengthen them up, make sure they've got enough headcount to do more research, give us analysis on legislation. If somebody's passing a law, how much is that going to cost, right? If someone's putting together a program, what are they expecting the goals to be? How do you measure success? How do you make sure it's effective, right? The vacancies. If you've got the vacancies at the department and you're not hiring, typically what happens is people move that vacancy money and use it to fund other things without checking with the council, right? We want to find out, are you hiring up to those vacancies? If not, why do you have the vacancies to begin with? If you're not using that money, where's that going, right? Also, how good are we at securing grants? Are we doing a good job? Could we be doing better? We want to establish quarterly budget update hearings. We also want to hear, let's say, for example, this budget gets voted on. The budget office says, here's what we identify as projections. Here's how it's going to look. We want to have another hearing mid-year to find out, did it really do what it said we were going to do? Are we doing well based on those projections? Because if we don't know that earlier on, we're going to be surprised by deficits down the line. It's doing the workforce allocation studies. We've also talked about looking at cost benefit analysis of special events, but also things like moving the budget address up a month. Instead of waiting until mid-October, let's have it in September and give the COFA, the Council Office of Financial Analysis, give them a month, and give Better Government Association a month, or Center for Tax and Budget Accountability a month, or the Civic Federation a month. Because when we got the budget, I ended up organizing meetings with those three good government organizations and the members of City Council so they could learn more about the analysis. And all of the parties, every organization was like, well, here's my analysis, but I've only had 3 days to look at it. That doesn't lead to good government. It doesn't lead to better decisions. And it puts us on a path that leaves us in larger problems down the line. So we're looking to get all of those things addressed in the management ordinance. And it's something I'm currently drafting along with some of our colleagues and circulating amongst them. So if we get more people on board, 26 members of the council, we can say, hey, you know what? We're tired of you guys telling us that you got to vote on taxes. You better show us your homework early in the year so we can all figure this out together instead of cramming us to try to do it in the last quarter. So as those things develop, we'll be talking, we'll be updating our neighbors to let you know how it's going. Next slide. Okay. This is the graph showing what the property tax would look like based on the actual value of the property. The top 6 that have been crossed out are the things that the council basically shot down that Mayor Johnson had presented. And so where he then started, once the 300 was voted down, was 150 million, which is what you're looking at there. Now, again, no one's agreed to any of these numbers, and you have to have 26 members of the council agree as to what would be a property tax, if there is a property tax, or what other structural taxes or fees are implemented to close that deficit. So that's what you're seeing right now is internally are the negotiation, the conversation to figure out what a consensus and majority of the city council would agree to. Next.
Oops, that's not nice.
Okay, so that is the presentation. And now we want to get to some questions. I know we've got a bunch that were being answered as we were talking. So how do we want to handle that? Because I see there's 11.
So I will go ahead and ask questions as we go.
Okay.
So the first one is about animal care and control. So there's a lot of questions about funding and why it's been cut to animal care and control, and the fact that time has been cut from the adoption time, that more animals are being euthanized within a week of surrender. Can we speak a little bit to those cuts and whether funding restoration is possible?
So I think, I mean, if we're having the conversation that we're talking here, we're trying to find efficiencies. And I think that's where some efficiencies were being found. So if you're looking at funding restoration, you're growing the deficit further, right? There are conversations, I think, in the long term to figure out, are there ways to consolidate our level of government with other levels of government? For example, can we look at what county does and maybe say, hey, here's what a partnership looks like. Let's county have more ownership over this. Or for example, the Chicago Board of Elections, there's an Illinois Board of Elections. can those things be consolidated in a way that saves us funds? So these are things to raise up, and we're happy to bring it up to the administration. But the challenging part is, again, 26 members have to say, we all want to see this increase, and we're willing to pay for that increase. And that becomes part of the challenge.
Yeah, and just context for you on that, CACC did take a little bit of a cut this year. They went down from about 7.7 million to about 7.5 million. But the previous year, they went up from about 7 million to that 7.7. So they've gone up a bunch and then down a little bit. And the hard thing with CACC is that in the big picture of the budget, these numbers are really vanishingly small. Like things that are just tiny drops in the bucket are pretty big proportional effects on that department because it is so small relative to the entire budget.
Yeah, it's also trying to figure out how to make the programs more efficient, meaning like we talked to the Department of Technology and Innovation to figure out, are there things we could do better if we just did better tracking, better programs, better interfaces. That has a lot of cost on the front end, but could save you a lot in the long run in a way that makes the programs more effective too.
Yeah, and I can say, first of all, kudos to how many 40th Ward folks are active volunteers with CACC. It's like very lovely to see how many folks have reached out about this. It does seem like there are some of the issues that people are identifying maybe aren't budget issues, but are maybe how things are happening issues. And those are things that we as a staff and Alder Vasquez as an alderperson can ask about in budget hearings and get answers on and make sure we have accountability and see if there are changes that we can do that don't necessarily have a financial impact, but that do have impact on lives of animals.
And they have not had their budget hearing yet. It's next week. So folks who want
we'll bring it up.
comment or weigh in on that is still an opportunity.
Yeah, this is also a great time to pitch in general. If you have a question that you really want to know from a department, let us know, because that's what we do. We as a staff, if we're seeing something that's like really not working in a particular department, we let Alder Vasquez know so he can ask about it in budget hearings. So you can do the same. And if there's something you really want to know, let us know and we'll see if we can find out. This question is for Geoffrey. Did you relate to alderpersons the dozen or so cost-saving ideas that the BGA advocates for? Do you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Alderpersons have heard from the BGA this budget cycle and will continue to. And both credit and thanks to Alderman Vasquez for being instrumental in inviting us to do that City Hall briefing. I think that's really very, very helpful for the alderpersons. We also have most of them signed up for the budget snapshots. They are getting those every morning. So they're getting the analysis of this year's budget. And a number do reach out, and we've talked with a bunch of alders about both new revenue ideas and efficiency ideas, things that can bring savings over time. And the other thing the BGA really does, I mean, our core mission, the budget is a nice add-on that I'm happy to have brought to them, but primarily their function for many, many years has been protecting transparency and accountability and open government. So that's your Open Meetings Act, your FOIA, your access to city council chambers and public comment at city council. Fighting to prevent anything from eroding those is what we spend a lot of our time on. And around budget season, that becomes very important. You know, that is how other people have their ability to have their voices, make their voices known, and to FOIA the kind of information that you don't get just out of the budget documents that are provided publicly. So that was a long way of saying yes, the alder people hear from us probably more than they would like to during budget season and throughout the year.
Thank you. This is also a great moment to thank Geoffrey, and also they're not here, but the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and the Civic Federation. This kind of independent analysis is so crucial to make sure that city council is able to do their jobs. So thank you, Geoffrey, and everybody. If you see Geoffrey around, you should thank him. Okay, we got a couple questions about police. So we got a question here about how much the DNC impacted extra CPD overtime. I think we can say it did. I don't know if we have the information of exactly how much.
Yeah, and I know that for some of that, the DNC did pay for it, but we can definitely ask that question, get the information, and like make sure we send it back. So a lot of the questions are here. We want to put together like the Q&A on that and email it back to folks so we can find that.
Awesome. Why are police and fire both listed under CPD vehicles?
So I think
that was, yeah, go ahead.
I think this one comes from that slide where I had the largest appropriations. One of the large appropriations for CPD is, it's called vehicles, police, and fire, or something along those lines. Which that just means that's the category, just like there's the wages and salaries appropriation, and virtually every department has a wages, all departments, even LAC has one staff member. All departments have a wages and salary appropriation. So there are a couple departments, police and fire, and I think also fleet and facilities management have that vehicles dash police and fire appropriation under it. So the amount that you saw for CPD was not the total amount the city is spending on all police and fire vehicles. It's just what CPD is budgeting for its expenses of police vehicles in their case.
Who is responsible for the collection of the 30 million for CPD overtime at special events?
That's a great question. I was actually asking the department myself. They don't know. So we went to the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. They directed us to the Department of Finance. I asked them, they're like, we're trying to figure out a system so one can talk to the other. I'm like, who's the person who emails the other person to figure this out? And so we're waiting to get that answer from them. So it's answers like that that are really concerning, because this is fundamental things. You're just collecting funds. And the fact that that communication isn't happening is something that needs to be formalized, standardized, and established. And that's something we're looking to do.
Appreciate the breakdown on the mayor's office. Will the alders ask for cuts there? Alder Vasquez, thoughts on that?
Yes, we are absolutely looking for mayors, because in the last 5+ years, that budget's actually doubled. So Lori Lightfoot increased it from Rahm Emanuel's budget. Johnson has increased it from Lightfoot's budget. And so we're looking at not only maybe the head count or the cost, but also some of the raises. There's folks that like have just been hired that are getting paid $190,000 a year. To my understanding, and talking to some of our colleagues, there's White House staffers that don't get paid that much. And so those are things that are being discussed. There's a number of colleagues that are actually putting together like a list of efficiencies, and then we're all going to discuss to see what we agree on.
And getting just a tiny bit deeper in the weeds, mayor's office is one of a number where you are able to have more of a conversation about changes in pay and changes in staffing than you necessarily are at others, because most of those are non-union positions. You've got a lot more people who are either exempt or non-represented, so their salary is more negotiable. A lot of them are what we used to call the Shackman exempt hires. Shackman's over now, but that are still fundamentally at-will political hires rather than members of the civil service who have union protection. So the mayor's department is one that's going to come up when you start talking about any kind of changes in compensation or staffing.
And similarly, we're talking marginal amounts compared to the whole budget, but that doesn't look to see where you find efficiencies.
So we have a couple of related questions about how all this squares with business. So one of them is when we're looking about at the effect of taxes like the cloud computing tax, how are we thinking about what that means for retaining or attracting businesses? And on that same note, how can we recruit more businesses to Chicago? Why is that not happening faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID has definitely taught a lot of businesses that they don't necessarily need footprint, that they're able to do a lot of the positions and work anywhere they're at for some of the jobs. And so I think that there are challenges there. We do think about the effect of these taxes on those businesses and really to the consumer, because it tends to get passed down, right? So when you're looking at cloud computing, that's one where we're actively looking and going, well, what's the pushback if you do that? If you're increasing only 2%, what do you hear back from those folks? And you got to think, if a 2% increase equals $120 million, the amount of money they're making when you're only doing a 2% increase shows you like there's some businesses that could withstand it more than others. A conversation that's come up is the liquor tax, right? So the liquor tax, we're talking about increasing cents per can, right? Beer or per bottle of wine. You might be able to raise something like $10 million. We've been hearing from restaurants and bars that have said, look, we had to deal with the pay time off law that passed. We had to deal with the fact that we eliminated the tip wage. Those are costs that we're still trying to figure out. We're still recovering over COVID. And so if you're doing the liquor tax on top, that's just, it's a lot. And so we do take into account that feedback, especially from like our local businesses, because we want to make sure, and I said this earlier today, I was on a podcast with Fran Spielman from the Sun-Times, that like, you don't look at this stuff with a meat cleaver. You've got to be a scalpel. You have to be precise with what you're doing, knowing that people are impacted with those changes.
Awesome. If the budgeting process timeline is a big part of the problem, can the city council vote to change that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're looking to do in the management ordinance is change that whole ball game so it's year round rather than waiting until the end of the year.
There are some limits from state law. State law says the mayor gets to present the budget. There's no way around that. The actual formal presentation of the budget is always going to be up to the mayor, but city council can do a lot to require information to be made available before then that isn't the complete budget. Things like what are the departments asking for when they submit to OBM? Those are things that can be asked for. And then once the mayor has made the budget presentation, once you have that budget address and you get the book, city council can control the timeline of when you have hearings
Well,
and when votes get taken and things
I
like
was
that.
gonna say the control part's challenging because there's not a lot to enforce what we're writing.
Yeah.
The real way to enforce it, if I'm being straight up with everybody here, it's public shaming. It's having hearings and going, you guys didn't deliver what you said you were going to deliver by the code. Why are you not meeting these deadlines? And continuing to make that an issue publicly until they do the things they're supposed to do, which we are more than willing to do in that instance too.
And I will say there are plenty of cities that are models of somewhat better timelines, right? New York's mayor has to come out with some preliminary numbers very early in the year. There are cities that have entire budget offices fully staffed with like 50 plus employees who the mayor has to turn his proposal over to, and then you get months to analyze it. Chicago really is something of an outlier in how little time and how little staff the legislature has compared to how much time the mayor gets to prepare it.
Right.
So I know we're running up at 7:30. We have a couple more and I think they'll be pretty quick. So let's see if we can get through them. What taxpayer or alder control is there over the CPS budget? Totally separate budget process, right? So there's not.
Yeah, the way it's a good question. So historically, the city would pay the pension payment for CPS, right? They would pay that. When Lightfoot got into office, she actually entered into a memorandum of understanding, maybe an agreement with CPS that they would actually start paying some of that back and ramp them up to something so they could get used to paying their own payments. So they would pay like 175 out of 300 million would be reimbursed. What happened when Johnson got in? Well, okay, when Lightfoot did that, Johnson and CTU said, that's horrible. Why would you do that? You're hurting kids, you know? Then Johnson became elected and became mayor. I was like, actually, that's kind of a good idea now, because now we don't have to necessarily take on that payment. So he was trying to get the same ramp up happening. The part that became challenging this time is they're in the middle of a contract negotiation with CTU, which increases the costs. So what CPS Pedro Martinez has said is, we can balance this budget, but we can't balance the budget and also make the pension payment. And that's what we saw happen publicly about the $300 million pension payment. Mayor Johnson didn't want to take it to pay it either. So they're playing hot potato with a pension payment. And what the mayor suggested to CPS is, you know what you guys should do? Take out a short-term, high-interest loan to cover that debt. And so those of you who may have been following me publicly, that would be the equivalent of you maxed out your credit card, your interest rate is horrible, and somebody shows up and says, you know what you should do? Take out another credit card with another horrible interest rate. That should solve the problem. It doesn't. It actually causes larger problems that our kids are going to end up paying for. So what we said is, if CPS can't afford to do it, it does make sense for the city to make this payment and say, hey, next year you got to sort this thing out. And it also puts a lot of pressure on that CTU contract, which is why you're seeing a lot of that happening, which is why you're seeing Mayor Johnson said he hasn't said it, but moving to fire the CEO. It's why you saw the Board of Education all resign because they didn't agree with the decisions that were being made. So a lot of that is tied in, but technically CPS has its own budget, but for that pension payment.
So quick question for Geoffrey. There's a question here about for the 2025 budget, whether you included the 5% automatic tax increase in your analysis.
So short answer is no. The snapshots are based on what the mayor proposed. So that included the full tax levy increase, which was about a 20% increase on the previous year's levy. So that's the revenue number that was proposed. That's what we worked with. Now, obviously, if you wanted to go back and run the numbers with saying, all right, if you didn't do that, but you did run 5%, what would it be? And one of the frustrations about this situation is that if city council had just kept that interest tied or 5% since Lightfoot passed it, it would have gotten us to almost exactly the same levy that was being proposed this year, but you would have done it step by step over the years rather than it being a one lump sum thing. So, but no, as far as the budget snapshots go, they are based on what Johnson initially proposed.
All right, and then I'll answer this last question because I know it's one that I hear all the time. We just need less aldermen and less ward offices. So there is a question there. It's a fair conversation to have to go, hey, if we cut this down, are there savings to be found? There are some savings to be found. Again, it would be marginal. But the other thing that's different, and this is historical, so it's not saying yes or no to like the proposal. Other cities work differently than Chicago. So in New York, for example, the city council is only legislators. They're not service providers. Nobody's calling their local city council member in New York to get a tree trimmed, to get a pothole taken care of, to do any of that. The departments do it completely themselves, independent of any of it. The challenge there, if this city were to do it the same way, one department would have to answer the questions of 2.7 million people calling them directly to solve the problem, as opposed to what you have with 50 wards, where each of us have about 65,000 neighbors that we serve. So let's say, for example, you were to consolidate that to half. Let's do 25 alders. You would then have each alder be in charge, would serve 130,000 neighbors in all the calls that they're getting. Or if you lowered it even further and said, let's do the departments do it, they would all have to address it. So if you think that you're having challenges from your ward office being responsive now, you get used to what that might feel like. That's not to be said it's not a way to do it, but even the transition to get to that model would be a challenge. And so I do think it's a fair conversation to have. I'm always open to that conversation, but it's really looking at what that looks and feels like. Because it's a concept, but you never know what you get behind door number 2, for example.
And I will say part of that conversation too is some things that city council has done and that Alderman Vasquez has been a leader on, changing services that are historically been complaint driven and ward based to citywide. The tree trims is the big example, right? Going to the grid-based tree trims on that. You know, the Illinois Answers Project, our newsroom did an analysis on that this year, and it's been wildly successful. The efficiencies are there. It's pretty well proven at this point that that was a good choice from both a service perspective and a money perspective. And that's moving away from Chicago's old model of everything flows through the ward office. Something's wrong, call a complaint in, your alderman's going to take care of it. There's a lot more of that to be done before Chicago resembles how most other cities work. And before, you know, you can really start talking about, hey, let's take the ward offices out of the picture entirely, because right now they really do still fill a very important function in getting those most of the services taken care of. But moving towards those non-ward based citywide services is steps in the right direction.
And that'll lead to a shameless plug, because we do our regular town halls to show people how many things we get done, what kind of services are being provided, so you get to see the return on investment for those tax dollars. But yeah, definitely a fair question. And with that, here's some contact information for you all to reach out. And we'll keep you updated. You know, we've got our Facebook account, we've got info, we've got Instagram. Y'all know I got a TikTok page where we do videos and budget updates as well. We want to make sure folks are informed, because the more you understand how your government works for you, the more you understand how your employees work for you, the better you can hold us accountable. So, and with that, I'll let you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and see you soon. See you across the board. Take care.
Thank you all so much.